Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I come to you on this cold and rainy Tag Tuesday with the Bookish A to Z Hot or Not tag created by the wonderful Greg at Another Bibliophile Reads. I was tagged by Greg in his original video, as well as by Will Chambers and Heather Reads of wonderful booktube channels that are still quite small. If you're not familiar with them, I definitely encourage you to go check them out. I'll leave links to them in the show notes. Greg's instructions for this tag are, quote, try to be fast and on topic. For those of you who have been around my channel for a while, you know I often lapse into long storytelling episodes. But I'm going to try to control myself today and get through these alphabetical prompts fairly quickly. So let's get started. A is for audiobooks. I'm not an enormous audiobook fan, but I do enjoy listening to them sometimes when I'm on a long walk or when I'm in the car for a very long drive. To be honest, I often lose track of where I am in a novel when I try to listen. I start thinking about what the author is trying to do in a particular section, and while I'm thinking, the story has continued and I have missed the whole thing. I do much better with memoirs in general, especially nature-oriented memoirs where the specific plot is not as important as the atmosphere. B is for Bildungsroman, a book that focuses on a person's formative years or spiritual education. Definitely hot. I've gravitated to Bildungsroman since I was a very young reader, from a childhood biography of Helen Keller to the novel Little Women of Louisa May Alcott, two books I think I mentioned in my last video. The term Bildungsroman usually refers to books about the main character's childhood years, but I also really enjoy books where a mature adult goes through a process of development too, whether it's from the raising of a child, the caretaking of a parent, a major career shift, etc. Those aren't precisely Bildungsroman, but are kind of closely adjacent. C is for children's books. Yes, I love reading children's books, especially when I'm reading them aloud with young people. Often the text is carefully constructed and tight, using rhyme or rhythm. Many of you know I love to read short stories aloud, especially when the authors are influenced by an oral culture of storytelling. Here, these books are specifically written with their orality in mind. D is for digital books. A qualified yes here. I got my first Kindle for the winter holidays back in 2008, I think. It was a gift from someone who had asked me what I wanted. At the time, I was writing evaluations for book proposals from university presses, and also reviews sometimes of published academic books for scholarly journals. Those presses sent out attachments by email, and it was much easier to read them on an e-reader than on my computer. And then I started downloading free versions of classic literature, filling my Kindle with the complete works of various Victorian writers, etc. And then, very soon after that, I discovered NetGalley and began to read and review nonfiction there. All of this is to say that I got started using e-readers in a critical way. That is, I was usually reading on my Kindle with a very specific goal of writing a critique. When I read physical books, I tend to read fairly critically as well, I guess, but I don't think of it as related to work, to an assignment. Still, I love the convenience of throwing my tiny little Kindle, now paperwhite, in a bag when I'm on the go, and knowing that I have a great variety of choices with me whenever I have a moment to read. E is for experimental. I am a sucker for the idea of experimental reading. I love hearing other people talk about how they approach the complexities of books like James Joyce's Ulysses, for example. I read the first half of Joyce's book aloud with my husband while we were in Ireland nearly a decade ago, and I very much enjoyed playing through those puzzles with him over our pints of Guinness. But to be honest, when I'm reading alone, by myself rather than in a group, I like to focus more on the characters, on the beauty of language, on what feels quiet and plain, universal? Is there something experimental in the work of authors like Marilyn Robinson or Bell Hooks? I think there is, but I don't think many of us readers mean that kind of work when we use the word experimental. F is for fantasy. This is my first strong not hot. I thought fantasy was stupid when I was a little girl, and therefore I have read almost no fantasy since then. I realize this is ridiculous, and so please, if you have a particular fantasy in mind that you think might fit in with my general reading style, please let me know down in the comments. Oh, actually, I did study a few late 19th century and early 20th century feminist fantasies, like Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, back when I was in graduate school. But I was looking at them as sources of information about the thinking of another era, rather than as novels to read for pleasure. G is for graphic novel. Another not hot for me. There is very little that makes me feel as stupid as I feel when I pick up a graphic novel. Yes, there are plenty of books that are beyond what I can understand. Academic books, but even many popular books about math or physics are beyond me. But I don't feel stupid when I don't have an easy time with something that's really hard, or something that I'm just not at all educated about. But even little kids, even barely literate little kids, seem to be able to follow graphic novels. I am so used to focusing on words when I read that I frequently go many panels without catching some vital clue that was only shown in the pictures. And even trying to follow the order of speech bubbles to see who said what when leaves me exhausted and distracted. I know there are some more quiet graphic novels, and ones that I very much enjoyed, including Mouse and Persepolis and March. But I don't routinely read graphic novels, and I won't pick one up unless someone tells me very specifically that a particular graphic novel is really right for me. H is for horror. Not hot, unless it is Edgar Allan Poe. I is inspirational. I'm easily inspired by the actions of other people. In fact, I think that is one of the reasons why I'm so attached to Bildungsroman. Watching characters grow and mature as they have new experiences is fairly inspiring. On the other hand, it's really hard for someone to say or do something specifically designed to inspire me. Usually, in fact, it can have the opposite effect. The most recent inspirational book I picked up was The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse by Charlie Magsy. Everyone I know here on BookTube and in person seems to love this book, but I was so allergic to its unsubtle moral didacticism that I DNF'd it. Yes, I DNF'd a picture book. And yes, I DNF'd the book that everyone says the world needs most right now, with its precious and heartfelt message of kindness to others. Forgive me. J is for journalism. Well, here we get to a slight complication. Journalism definitely gets a hot from me, but I've been so overwhelmed by the news of the world lately, on top of my own personal grief, that I've not been keeping up with the news nearly as much as I normally have in the past. I need to find a schedule for myself so I can catch all the highlights each morning, or maybe each evening, without fearing that I'll start to be swallowed by the breaking news all day long. K is for kitsch, that is, books that have a popular or sentimental appeal. I don't tend to gravitate towards kitschy books. I seem to have been born without that isn't it ironic bone that allows people to appreciate kitsch. My husband David did, though. I'd never seen him laugh as hard as he did when he saw one of our friends carrying his groceries in his baby's old front carrier. And at some point, he suggested he needed a brain kippah, a brain yarmulke, or Jewish head covering. I said no to that one. L is for library. Well, this is absolutely the hottest thing on this A to Z list. I live within easy walking distance of 3 different public libraries and 1 community college library. Technically, I live in Maryland, but very, very close to the DC city line. So one library is a tiny one for my town specifically. One is a branch of my county's library, and one is a branch of the DC library. I use our county library to access interlibrary loan books too, not for pure pleasure reading, but for academic work in general. There are also university libraries in the general area, as well as my beloved Library of Congress, which is actually easier for me to access than university libraries, and is absolutely gorgeous, as well as quite comprehensive in its holdings. M is for mystery. Yes, I used to read a lot of mysteries and always planned to have more on my monthly TBRs, but I haven't actually picked one up in some time. I think I need to do that over the winter holidays. Tell me your favorite new one, especially if you think I might like it. N is for nonfiction. Hot, hot, hot. I am a very regular nonfiction reader, as well as a writer of a variety of kinds of nonfiction, from academic to memoir to book criticism. I've been talking about my love of nonfiction in previous videos this month, and I have another couple planned for the next few weeks, so I won't say more here. O is for omnibus. I tend to think they are not hot. They're too heavy and large, and often have both poor quality paper and tiny print. P is for poetry. I'm a fan of poetry, especially, unlike Steve Donahue, late 20th century American poetry. I'll leave it at that and talk about my experience with poetry in a future video. Okay? Next, Q is for quests. Books where the protagonist goes on a quest, be it physical or spiritual. I don't love books where the quest is laid out in really bald ways, but I love more subtle variations when the characters are trying to learn something or accomplish something or even find something, but where the plot focuses more on character development than the action required for the quest. I'm thinking about books from the children's classic Undersea Over Stone by Susan Cooper to Herman Melville's Moby Dick. R is for romance. I don't read much actual romance, I guess, but I love plots that center at least partly around romances. Jane Eyre is very much a romance, as is Pride and Prejudice, and they are among my very favorite books of all time. In general, I want romances to focus on how emotional connections between two people play out, how love changes people, that is. I do want to mention the first book I read, which I really realized was clearly a romance novel, Annie on My Mind by Nancy Garden, first published in 1982 or something around then, about 2 girls who fall in love with each other and begin to understand a new way to think about themselves. It's really beautiful. S is for science fiction. I've only read a handful of science fiction novels, and in general, they have not been a great fit for me. Octavia Butler is a huge exception. Her book Kindred was the first science fiction draw for me, partly because of its discussion of slavery, and partly because of the fact that it is intensely character and relationship driven. Most people tell me I will love The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. Thoughts? T is for translated books. Hot, although I definitely don't read as much in translation as I ought to. In fact, probably the majority of the books I've read in translation have been from the ancient world. So here's another one where I would love some recommendations down in the comments of contemporary-ish books, meaning 20th or 21st century books, that you think I might especially like that are translated. U is for Ubermensch, the Superman or the extraordinary human who can do everything. I absolutely hate this kind of literature. First, those characters lead to what I see as a boring plot where we know what is going to happen, and to characters who can't really grow emotionally. Even worse, Superman-style characters reinforce ideas about the appropriateness of social hierarchy, and books with Ubermensch characters often quite baldly and specifically embrace hierarchies based on race, and perhaps especially gender. As the youngsters say these days, fight me. V is for Victorian literature. Definitely hot. Victorian literature is what first introduced me to grown-up literature and helped me get beyond Nancy Drew. And despite the fact that I have read fairly deeply in Victorian literature and reread deeply, there's still plenty more, and the amazing Victober celebration always helps me learn about more titles and more authors every year, too. W is for Western. I still haven't read Lonesome Dove, which is now on my shelf, and that, I think, is the only Western in the usual meaning of the word that really appeals to me. I am fascinated right now with the literature of the West and Midwest, books that usually aren't called Westerns, but more on that sometime in a future video. X is for X-rated. I'm not interested. I did read Vox, was that its name, by Nicholson Baker when it first came out. Totally a macho version of what pleasure means. And like the Ubermensch problem, X-rated books seem so likely to reinforce the cultural acceptance of misogyny. So definitely not hot for me, in either meaning of the word. Y is for young adult. I haven't read a lot of YA fiction. Actually, earlier I mentioned Nancy Garden's Annie on My Mind, which looking back would definitely qualify as YA, I think. But a lot of YA is building on a lack of subtlety. Things all feel so big in YA. I've read some John Green, which I think I might have enjoyed if I'd read the books when I was a preteen. And my major claim to fame is that I taught John Green. I was a TA in a 3-week, all-day summer class at a camp created for what my friend calls heinously gifted teenagers. He definitely was one. You might check out his American History Crash Course series on YouTube to see some of the things he might have learned at nerd camp. Z is for zeitgeist. That is, books that reflect the spirit or mood of the times. I don't tend to read books like this, I guess, when they're first published, but I'm absolutely fascinated by them in later decades. I guess at that point, I'm reading them more as an historian than as a pleasure reader, and I'm explicitly interested in learning about the zeitgeist of that particular period more than I am enjoying the plot or characters or whatever. I've saved a bunch of versions of the A to Z hot or not tag to watch after I film, and I'm hoping to see what books you might have chosen to represent the zeitgeist of today. I'm wondering if we can really name it at the time when it's happening, or if we can only call it the zeitgeist in retrospect. Well, that will do it for this tag. Thank you so much, Greg, for creating this tag, and thank you to Greg and Will and Heather for tagging me, and thanks to all of you for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.